Holy smokes, everybody. There is something absolutely crazy that's going on in the US stock market with the economy and with inflation, and we have to talk about what's happening with the stock market right now. Yesterday, Jerome Powell gave a speech, and a lot of investors were anticipating that he was going to announce that the Federal Reserve will start tapering its balance sheet and may give some guidelines for when it'll start hiking interest rates to get inflation under control. But of course, Jerome Powell, J-Dog, got on his pedestal and continued to talk up the markets. He continued to tell investors, don't worry, Papa Powell's here with his money printer, and he's not going to be lifting interest rates anytime soon, and the markets are going to keep going up. Well, okay, this sounds like great news, and we should all go all in on the S&P 500 right now. We'll just hold up there 1 minute, Johnny. What we have to talk about today is a scenario that could be worse than a 50% stock market crash, and something that the US is heading closer and closer to. So what is this scenario, everybody? This is a stock market crash up. A crash up? What you talking about, Willis? What you have to know is inflation is getting out of control in the US. And the central banks and the government officials keep saying it's nothing to worry about, it's just temporary, it's just transitory, and it's all going to go away soon. Well, the government and the central banks have always said this just before every crisis. Now what we're seeing with the global supply chains is the supply chain issues aren't being fixed. Freight prices are going up anywhere between 500 and 1,000%, and we're seeing more delays for consumer goods. Costs are going up to send things around the world because of the shutdowns that are going on around the world, and manufacturers and producers and exporters are saying they're going to have to increase their prices, and it's just a matter of time before this starts hitting the prices on the shelves. So the US is getting closer and closer, and it's really dancing on a knife's edge. It's really playing in dangerous territory that could lead to hyperinflation. Now, a market crash up scenario, or what you call a market melt up, is where the stock market goes parabolic, but the price that the stock market is going up is not keeping up with the rate of goods and services, or the rate of inflation for goods and services. So for example, the S&P could go to 50,000, but if the price of a loaf of bread is $100, what's the good of that? But in order for us to get an idea of what may happen in the future, it's a good idea to learn from history. So let's have a look at some list of countries where the stock market has crashed up or melted up or gone completely parabolic, but it's had devastating effects for the country, for the citizens, and for the economy. And it's not a good scenario. It's actually even worse than a market crash. Well, first things first, Argentina. Right now, Argentina is having annual inflation at 54.8%, and their stock market is going completely parabolic. It's skyrocketing. And investors may think, oh, that's great that the stock market is going up so much. But again, everybody, if you have a look at Argentina, you ask the Argentinian citizens, the stock market appreciation is not keeping up with the costs of goods and services. And last time I checked, the Argentina economy isn't going that great. Again, we all know the story of Zimbabwe. Look at the Zimbabwe stock market. It was a great performing stock market, but also Zimbabwe right now is facing an annual inflation rate here of 161%. Venezuela, you can see their stock market. It went completely parabolic. Investors again may think this is a great news, but that's terrible news, because Venezuela is facing an annual inflation rate of 200,000%. Not good at all. And another one, Iran. Again, their stock market, as we can see, has gone completely parabolic. But Iran is also in a crisis with annual inflation at 51% and an economy that's on the brink. But that's just Venezuela, that's just Argentina, that's just Zimbabwe, that's just Iran. But it's not just these countries. The list is growing of countries that are collapsing due to hyperinflation. But of course, that will never happen here, not in the mighty USA. The empire will never fall. Well, I'll just bring up a couple of charts here. First, let's have a look at the dollar's purchasing power. As we can see, since 1920 and in 1913, really, when the Federal Reserve was created, the US dollar's purchasing power has been crashing. And if we flip this chart, It really looks like the S&P 500. I'll bring up a chart here of the S&P 500. As we can see, it is starting to go on that parabolic vertical curve, and if inflation does get out of control, we may see the stock market go parabolic, but it's not going to be good news for the US. Another chart here just to prove this from the US Federal Reserve. This is the price index for all urban consumer prices and purchasing power. We can see here it's completely collapsing. Now they're saying inflation is just 5.4%. Well, I know, you all know, if you get out there on the streets and go to the shops or just want to buy a car or buy a house, then inflation is much higher. And Shadow Stats shows that they actually changed the way they recorded inflation in the 80s and the 90s. And they're having, if they calculate it the way they did in the 80s, inflation rate would actually be at 13.5% inflation. So these stock market returns, if they don't keep up with a 12 to 13% price growth year on year from here, well, they're not actually keeping up with the rate that your purchasing power is being diminished, and they're not keeping up with consumer goods. And again, they used to record inflation by the increase of the money supply. And look at this. This is the M2 money supply. Again, going completely parabolic. And I'll bring up a chart here. We can put the Federal Reserve's balance sheet and other central banks' balance sheet, which is the blue line, and the S&P 500 is a red line. As these go up together, so does the stock market. But there's something interesting happening, everybody. The Federal Reserve have actually printed too much money, so something called the reverse repo market, which I'm sure you've all heard about, done videos about before, this is going nuts. Banks are parking over $1 trillion every day at the Federal Reserve in order to get interest on that money and also to swap it for US treasuries, because there's too much money out there in the system. The Federal Reserve has printed too much money, and that's another reason why they may have to taper not just inflation, but there's too much money in the system. So everyone, just to put it simple, we may not actually see a stock market crash in US dollars, because if they're printing more and more US dollars and inflation is going up through the roof, stocks won't fall. But what may happen is, say for example, if you had a stock portfolio of 10,000 and then it goes up to 15,000 after a year, well, if we get crazy high inflation and they can't get inflation under control, or the way they're ruining your purchasing power by increasing the money supply by 25% a year, that stock portfolio may actually buy less goods and services, even though it's gone up in dollar terms. But the biggest risk that would lead the US into hyperinflation and a huge melt up or crash up in the stock market would be the US losing world reserve currency status. Now again, people are saying this will never happen, but we're seeing more and more countries trying to find a way to trade without US dollars, especially with oil. We're seeing Saudi Arabia and Russia entering with partnerships, Russia and China entering with partnerships, and Brazil and other countries. Because I'll bring up another chart here, everybody. The US dollar share of global foreign exchange reserves has dropped to a 25-year low. So even though it may sound like it's impossible and it'll never happen, remember, there's been many empires that have held world reserve currency status, and they all lost world reserve currency status, and normally it was after 110 years. So that means the US is overdue to lose its world reserve currency status. Okay, so if this crazy scenario does happen, what should we do to prepare? Well, what you're going to want to do to prepare is hold real hard assets. For example, like precious metals. Also, maybe even Bitcoin if you can hold it digitally in your own digitalized wallet. So that means you own it, not on any exchange. Now, some people don't believe in Bitcoin. I do think it's just a nice way to diversify with precious metals, with cryptocurrencies, but also things like farmland, land, real, hard assets like land. They will go up through the roof as people want to find a way to park their cash or park their worthless US dollars. And just random things like we're seeing now. Cars are going up, tools are going up, real hard things that you would need in case there was some kind of crazy, currency collapse. I'm sure there'll be a lot more barter going on than people wanting to trade their goods and services for worthless currency. So everyone, that was just a quick update on why the stock market hasn't crashed yet. And if this scenario plays out, like I said, it may never crash in dollar terms, but you have to look at the bigger picture and look at what is your stock portfolio getting you in real goods and services? And I think really the only way that the stock market is going to crash is when the Federal Reserve does actually lift interest rates, and that's an if they do lift interest rates, or some other kind of black swan event that will cause the market to crash, just like what happened with the pandemic in 2020. But everyone, what do you think? How likely do you think this scenario is to happen? Let me know. Now, for all my loyal viewers and subscribers still watching, you're awesome. If you haven't already, please tap that like and subscribe button. I'll keep you up to date with the latest happening in the stock market, housing market, and global finance news. Now, if you're bored, I'll put up some other videos here. I'll see you all there.